Well, hello, folks, and welcome to the Dieter Melhorn Fishing Podcast. I hope you're having a good day, whatever day it is that you happen to be listening to the show or watching the video version on YouTube. There's a version on there that you can check out. Feel free to leave some comments, especially on today's topic. It's a controversial one. It's about Paylakes. Some of y'all have no clue what a Paylake is. Some of you are well versed in what a Paylake is, and I'm going to go into a little detail explaining what Paylakes are for the people that don't know. And some of the people that do know don't know how they operate. We're going to talk about that a little bit just to give you some background and give us some perspective. This topic comes up every so often, and recently I saw a post on Facebook about it. And usually it starts with one of the Paylakes, putting some pictures on their social media and talking about how many fish they put in the lake. And the people who are trophy fish fishermen get upset about it, and they go flying off and want to stop them, ban them, whatever. And that's kind of how it goes. And generally, nothing ever happens. But here's the background on these lakes, what they do, how they work, and what it means to people who fish for trophy fish and also people who just fish. Basically, a Paylake is a private establishment, and they have a lake where you pay to fish. Some of these lakes have catfish in them. Some of them have carp in them. There are even trout lakes in certain places where you can pay to fish for these fish. Some places you can keep them. Some places you can't. Some places there's a limit on how many you can keep. And in a lot of these lakes, there is, I guess you would call a form of gambling. You pay money to enter a fishing contest, and they award prizes. Sometimes it's the biggest fish of the day, biggest fish of the hour, biggest fish of the week, biggest fish of the month. Sometimes it's nightly tournaments. There's all different ways this is done, and this is done for carp. This is done for catfish, and it's a way for people who, one, don't have a boat to go fishing. It is a way for someone who doesn't have access to the water. There may not be any rivers or lakes or any public areas to fish near you, and you can go pay to fish one of these places. It's for, if you're, let's say you're handicapped, you have a disability, you're in a wheelchair, or you need some type of a scooter to get around, you've got bad knees. Most of these places you can literally pull your car right up to where you're fishing and get out and go fish. So there's that aspect to it. And, for a lot of people, the gambling end of it, of the tournaments and, making some money, there's that aspect that is very appealing. And I grew up in an area where these lakes are all over the place. For the most part, they're carp lakes, and people would go carp fish there. There are some of them that have catfish. There were some that were stocked with catfish, small bullheads and channel catfish and that kind of thing. But most of them are oriented toward carp. Now, other parts of the country, that's a different story, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But on the surface, when you look at it, you go, well, that's pretty nice. You can go pay somewhere to fish, relatively affordable. It usually does not cost a lot of money to go fish one of these places unless you get into the tournaments and stuff that are going on. And it's relatively safe. It's probably a lot safer than pulling over on the side of a highway, walking down the road, and dropping down and going underneath the bridge on a highway fishing. It's probably a lot safer than that. And, the other aspect to it is it's easily accessible for somebody with mobility limitations. So there's that factor of it that on the surface, again, is very appealing. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and I remember growing up that I didn't know this, is that, where did these fish come from that are in those lakes? And that's where the two worlds collide and some of the problems happen. For some of these lakes, one we had around here, they would buy these fish. They were small bullheads or channel catfish. They would buy them from a fish farm. They would come in, very small fish, eating size fish. And there would be like a limit that you could keep of 10 fish. And they would bring these fish in by the hundreds, thousands, and dump them into the lake. And you would go pay and you would fish. And that was, one way that this was done. But there were some other lakes that had the bigger fish, the big carp, 40, 50, 60-pound carp. And, some of them had the bigger catfish. And what a lot of people don't realize that are not really immersed into this world is that those fish in those private lakes come from public waters. In other words, those fish are caught, trapped, whatever, and transported to these private lakes. Now, in some places, the lakes, the people who run the lakes themselves go out and catch these fish and take them back to their lake. But there's a big business of catching these fish and transporting them to these lakes. And that may be catching them from a lake that's 20 miles away and taking them to this private lake, or it may mean going to the James River in Virginia and catching them and driving them all the way back to Ohio or Indiana or someplace like that. And for the most part, what they're doing is absolutely perfectly legal. Catching the fish the way they catch them, for the most part, and a lot of these places, is absolutely perfectly legal. And selling them to these lakes and the lakes buying these fish, in most situations, is absolutely perfectly legal. Now, there are some states that have put limitations on fish being transported out of state, across state lines, but because catfish in most areas are not considered a game fish, they're a non-game fish species, they don't really have any limitations on the selling and the transport of them for the most part. So this is where, again, the worlds collide. There's a lot of big trophy fish that end up getting caught, trapped in baskets, nets, however they get them, that are taken out of these waters and sold to these Paylakes. And that means that waters that once had a lot of fish in them may be depleted of these fish, depending on how hard they're fished and how much effort's put into it. The bottom line is, in all of this, is we really don't know, outside of, just conjecture from fishermen, as to whether or not there is a negative impact. To listen to the guys from the Paylakes, their side of the story obviously is, man, we ain't got no problem catching, these trophy fish out of these lakes and putting them in our ponds. They're everywhere. There's tons of them. Y'all are crazy. Meanwhile, the fishermen are saying their rivers, lakes are being depleted and they don't have the trophy fish like they used to. Sadly, in nowhere that I can think of has there been any definitive research to prove or disprove either of these statements and either of these lines from either side. And like I was saying earlier, what makes it worse is that a lot of these Paylakes will put up these videos and these pictures when these truckloads of fish come in. And just like the thumbnail for this video, there are many trophy fish spread out that are put into these lakes. Now, if you don't know any better, you would think that, well, they stocked these lakes, one time, and man, they've got these fish in there and you don't have to stock them again. That's where the worlds collide again, because what people don't know, people don't realize, and don't really understand if you're not into this world, is that seemingly perfect little place in these Paylakes where you can go fish and there's a pond and everything's wonderful and there could be big fish, there could be a lot of them, you can catch some fish, you can do it all safely. The unseen part of it is that these lakes are not the ideal situation, the ideal ecosystem to put a lot of big fish into. Part of the problem is there's nothing for them to eat in there. There's not the forage base in there for them to feed on, grow, and prosper. And the lakes are not designed that way. They're designed to put these fish in there, very much a put and take type fishery. And there's no, in most of these lakes, really a way for these fish to sustain their mass and their size in there. The other thing in a lot of these lakes, some of them are not this way. Some of them are run very well because, in all honesty, these guys that run these lakes don't want to buy fish because that taps into their profits and that taps into their margin of profit. But most of them, the water itself is not conducive to keeping fish alive. Oxygen levels can be depleted, run down, and there's not a way that oxygen is being produced in there. A lot of these fish will end up dying, is the bottom line. Like I said, some places very well aerated. They have aeration systems in place, and they do a really good job with it. But for a lot of them, and I've seen some of these places locally, they're basically a relatively small lake, dug out with a backhoe, put a dam on one end of it, fill it up with some spring water, and see what the heck happens and see if we can keep them alive. And that's kind of the bad side to it. So it's not a ideal world, ideal environment. But as I said earlier, in most areas, it's perfectly legal. And it is something that, as it stands right now, nobody's really doing anything wrong legally. There's a lot of questions here to be raised whether or not that is ethically right as a sportsman. But I think part of the problem there is that word sportsman, in that I don't think there is a lot of emphasis, love for, protection, respect for catfish. And I think that's part of the basic problem, is that unlike bass, trout, some of the other sport fish out there, game fish that have protection in place because they're respected, catfish don't have that. You wouldn't really see this being done with bass to the sense that you would harvest bass, sell them to a private lake, and people, go through this. Now, you can do that legally with permits selling fish, but like I said, there's no permitting process in most states for any of this. So it's kind of a wild, wild west with doing this. And again, I think a lot of that ties back to just the lack of respect for catfish themselves. And it's a very polarizing topic because there are people that enjoy trophy fish, enjoy catching big fish in their public waters. And then there's guys that love to go to these Paylakes. Trust me, this is not a small minority of a few people fishing these lakes. There are tens of thousands of people fishing these Paylakes around the country. And they feel that what they're doing is okay. And by the law, they're right. It is okay. And that's where the worlds collide and the heads collide. And sadly, you would think that in today's world of all the information out there and communications, we could somehow hit some type of I don't know, common ground in all this. But I'm going to be honest with you, I hadn't seen it happen. I've spoke with wildlife officials here in my state, here in the Carolinas, and basically their take on it is that the Paylakes are not having an impact on our public fisheries. And I think that is probably more of a feeling, a gut feeling, than anything research-wise. Because like I said, there's no real research that is definitive in any of this. I haven't seen it. I wish there was. It may answer some questions. It may ease the minds of those who are the trophy fishermen that want these pay ponds eradicated. And or it could lead to demise of these places. There's been no real research, so we really don't know. All we have is what we feel is happening. And trust me, I'm one of those anglers that sees, a truckload of fish taken out of my lake. I don't necessarily like it, and I don't like seeing it. But in one sense, I also go, well, maybe it's good for the lake. There are there is research to that point that you may have too many fish in your lake. I find it hard to believe that you can have too many trophy fish. Maybe there is. The biologists out there, please chime in and give some feedback on that. I'd love to see if that can happen. But, it does hurt me to see those fish taken out. But there may be some good coming from it. It may mean that taking out, especially some of the more medium-sized fish to stock these places, may be good for the fishery. It may, mean that there's less competition for food, more food for the bigger fish. I don't know. Again, it's a world, it's a wild, wild west kind of world. But, I think for you guys that have never heard of a Paylake, now you know they exist. Now you can keep your eyes open for them. And if you fish Paylakes, you may not have had a clue as to how those fish got there. They don't grow them. None of these fish. That's the one thing about the Paylake deal. It's a death sentence it's the final stop for these fish. They will die there, and they will die there in short order. And it's if they make it through a summer, they probably did good. And that's kind of the ongoing problem, is that, and where the worlds collide, is that most of these places have to keep putting fish in there. Now, some of them are able to do it to where they stock it once a year, and their lake is in good enough shape, with water quality and oxygen, that the fish can live for several months, an entire year. Because again, these lakes don't want to be buying fish. They don't want to be going and catching fish. That ties up time. Money is an expense. And anybody that runs a business knows you don't want to have any more expense than you need. So they don't necessarily want to do it, but in the same breath, it's a big selling point for them too, when they can sprawl these fish out, show them going into the lakes, and get people excited. Because again, for a lot of people, they're not in my shoes. They're not in the shoes of a lot of you people that have access to the water, have a boat, that type thing. So it will be interesting to see if any of it's changed. There's always an outcry, and that's what I was kind of doing this podcast on. There's an outcry from the public all the time. We need to do something. They need to do something. Something needs to be done. And then nobody does anything. And that's just kind of true of a lot of problems when it comes to managing wildlife, whether it be fish, deer, turkey, whatever, is that most of the laws and regulations come as a reaction to a problem versus something that will prevent a problem. And, what's the step? Well, you got to get engaged with your local officials and see what the process is for doing that. And honestly, you got to see just what their temperament is. Some states may be more inclined to do something than others. And I believe here where I'm at in the Carolinas, I don't think we'll see any regulations on Paylakes. I don't know that there's that much concern, care, or worry on the part of the biologists as far as what's going on. Some other states, that may be a different story. But, there's a lot of ammunition to put an end to the transport of fish interstate, even from one body of water to another. It's a bad scenario where you can be spreading other fish from one body of water to another that they don't need to be in. You can also be spreading different organisms, bacteria, weeds, all that kind of thing. Most biologists will tell you transferring fish from one place to another is never a really good idea. You're asking for trouble. So there's again, ammunition to get these changes. The other thing is just, I think some of it's economic. Who's making the most money here? Are the Paylakes generating more money, or is the common trophy fisherman out there fishing for catfish generating the money, or is there enough to go around? I don't know. I'd love to see a good conversation happen. And if any of you guys that have Paylakes are watching, I invite you to be on the podcast. Reach out to me. We can either do it in person, or we can do it via Skype or something where we can talk a distance, Zoom call, something like that. I'd love to hear your perspective on all of this, because honestly, the only perspective I've seen is what has come out in the heated arguments that take place. And I think there's some common ground, some discussion that can be had here. And I think shedding some light on it, one, from the trophy fisherman's point of view to the Paylakes and vice versa, I think would be good. and maybe we can find some common ground and get something that's going positive, and maybe not. I don't know. I know how these things are. They're very heated, and there's a lot of hurt feelings on both sides that go on. So we'll see what happens with it. Hopefully that's giving you some education on this. Any of you guys that have questions, drop something in the comment. If you got questions about Paylakes, how this stuff works. I know it may be kind of confusing if you've never been exposed to them. And if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, go to my website, DieterMilhornFishing.com. There's a contact section on there where you can email me or text me and maybe clear up some of this stuff. So hopefully it's been informative. Appreciate you checking it out. We'll catch you out on the water.